Have you ever been in one of those arguments? You know, the kind where you're trying to explain something you believe in, something really deep, and it just feels like you and the other person are speaking two completely different languages? It's a huge challenge, right? Well, today, we're diving into a pretty radical answer to that problem from a 20th century theologian named Cornelius Van Til.
So let's just ask the big question right up front. How do you even start a debate when your basic, fundamental view of reality doesn't line up with the other person's? That's the core problem that a field called apologetics tries to tackle. And apologetics is really just the art and science of defending a particular belief system.
And you know, within Christian apologetics, this isn't just some small disagreement. Oh no, it has led to a massive clash of ideas, a real split in how to approach the whole thing. We're going to look at two totally different strategies for how to even begin that conversation.
So in one corner, you've got the traditional method. This one's all about building a bridge, finding some kind of neutral, common ground to stand on. But in the other corner, you have Cornelius Van Til's approach, which comes in and says, hold on a minute. When we're talking about ultimate beliefs, that neutral ground, it doesn't even exist.
Okay, so first up, let's look at the approach that's basically been the reigning champion for centuries, the common ground method. And honestly, it's the one that probably feels the most natural to most of us when we think about how to argue for something.
The big names behind this method are absolute heavyweights, people like Thomas Aquinas and Bishop Butler. And their core idea was pretty straightforward. You can start a conversation with someone who doesn't believe from a neutral position, using reason and facts that, in theory, both of you can agree on.
And the playbook looks something like this. Step 1. You start on what seems like safe territory, right? Shared facts about the universe, the laws of logic, things like that. Step 2. From there, you start to build a case that God's existence is probable. And that word is key. Probable, not certain. Then, and only then, after you've laid that groundwork, you move to step 3. You introduce the specific claims of Christianity.
So the whole game plan, the entire strategy, depends on finding this little patch of neutral territory. It's the spot where you can build that bridge from the world of shared reason over to the world of faith. But what if that neutral territory is just a mirage?
And this is exactly where Cornelius Van Til storms onto the scene. And he doesn't just disagree, he brings a wrecking ball to that entire tradition. For Van Til, this whole idea of neutrality wasn't just wrong, it was the fundamental mistake everyone was making.
Listen to Van Til's own words here. He basically argued that when you think you're starting on neutral ground, you're not being neutral at all. You're actually playing the game on the unbeliever's home turf, and you've already accepted their flawed rules and assumptions before you've even made your first move.
Now, to really get what Van Til is saying, you have to understand this one critical word, presupposition. A presupposition isn't something you argue to, it's something you argue from. It's your non-negotiable starting point, the lens that literally colors every single thing you see and interpret in the world.
And this is Van Til's central claim, the absolute heart of his argument. There is no neutral ground. None. The Christian starts with the presupposition of the God of the Bible. The non-Christian, on the other hand, starts with the presupposition of their own mind, their own autonomy, as the final judge of what's real and what isn't.
Van Til had this really powerful analogy for this. He said it's like the unbeliever is wearing a pair of colored glasses that are literally cemented to their face. Every fact, every piece of evidence you show them is automatically filtered and interpreted through that unchangeable lens.
So let's play this out. Imagine the traditional apologist comes along and presents a really powerful piece of evidence, like the historical case for the resurrection of Jesus. They lay out all the facts. You've got the eyewitnesses, the empty tomb, the whole deal. And what happens? The unbeliever, peering through those colored glasses, just takes that fact and tosses it into what Van Til called the bottomless pit of chance. To them, it's just another weird, unexplained event. It doesn't prove anything about God, because their starting assumption, their lens, is a universe where weird stuff can just happen for no reason. The argument just dies right there.
So if you can't start on neutral ground, where in the world do you start? Well, Van Til's alternative is radical. He says you start with God, not as a conclusion you're trying to prove, but as the precondition for proving anything at all.
For Van Til, the only starting point that makes any sense of reality is this absolute fundamental distinction between the creator and the creature. It's simple. There's God, who is self-sufficient and the source of everything. And then there's everything else. The universe, us, facts, logic, all of it is created by and dependent on him.
And this is such a crucial difference. The God of the Greeks, like Aristotle's God, was basically just a principle within reality, the biggest, best link in the chain of being. But the God of the Bible isn't a part of the universe at all. He is the transcendent creator of the entire universe. And for Van Til, this means you can't just slap Christian ideas on top of a non-Christian foundation. You have to start with the right foundation.
So his method, his playbook, is a total flip of the script. First, you start with the Bible as your absolute authority. Second, you don't argue that God's existence is just probable. You argue that it's objectively certain, that all of creation screams it out loud. Third, the real point of contact isn't some neutral reason. It's that every person has a deep built-in sense of God that they are actively suppressing. And finally, you don't just argue about a few facts. You challenge their entire philosophy of what effect even is in the first place.
And all of this leads to Van Til's boldest, most audacious claim. He doesn't just say that Christianity is more reasonable than other worldviews. No, he argues that it's the only reasonable position to hold. Any other starting point, he was convinced, eventually collapses into total meaninglessness and contradiction.
So where does this clash of worldviews leave us? What's the ultimate implication? Well, it forces us to look deeper, to stop just looking at our conclusions and to start examining our very own starting points.
Here's the most crucial takeaway. For Van Til, the big debate isn't about if you have a presupposition, because guess what? Everybody has one. The real debate is about which presupposition actually makes things like science, logic, morality, and knowledge itself even possible.
And this quote right here is his entire argument in a nutshell. What he's doing is making what philosophers call a transcendental argument. He's not building a ladder of evidence up to God. He's arguing that you have to start by standing on the foundation of God for things like truth or logic to make any sense at all. In other words, if you don't start with the transcendent, personal God who created an orderly universe and gave us minds that can actually understand it, then you have no good reason to assume that the laws of science will work tomorrow or that your five senses are telling you anything real about the world. It all, in his view, just falls apart.
And that brings this whole thing right back to you and me. Van Til's challenge forces a question on us that's bigger than any single argument. If it's true that everyone sees the world through a lens, through a foundational starting point, what's yours? And does it actually make sense of the world you live in?